Welcome to Brain Device. We are delighted to be joined by Barry Smith, and we're going to be talking about whether machines will ever be able to rule the world. Barry, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Yes, well, you tell me that you have never in this series dealt with Searle's Chinese room argument. Lots has been said about it, but, well, we can deal with the reception of late if we need to. So Charles Searle's Chinese room argument is a very simple argument. The idea is that there is a room, or you can think of it a box with slits, and inside this box is a human being, and the human being receives messages written in Chinese and has to produce responses to these messages. So the message might be, what is 2 plus 2? Or it might be, will it rain tomorrow? Or any kind of message that demands a response. Next to this Chinese room, because the inputs and outputs are going in Chinese, there is a second room, an exactly similar room, but in that room, there is a computer. And the computer has been programmed to process Chinese sentences and to generate reasonable responses to Chinese sentences. For instance, to the Chinese sentence, what is 2 plus 2? The computer responds 4. And now, Searle's argument is the following. The computer clearly does not understand the Chinese sentences. It's been programmed. It's a complicated mathematical algorithm which has been programmed to deal with symbols, which it doesn't know are Chinese because it doesn't know anything. It's just an algorithm. And when the algorithm is applied to a message which we would see to be in Chinese, then it generates an output which we would also see to be in Chinese. And a Chinese-speaking person could recognize that the output is in fact appropriate, given that input. Now we go back to the first Chinese room, which has a human being in the room. And this human being, call him Searle, does not understand Chinese, does not know any Chinese, but he has learned the rule book which governs the processes of the computer in the other room. And so when he receives the Chinese message, he does it painstakingly and with great care exactly what the machine does. Effectively, he applies the same algorithm to the input and yields then the same output. And now Searle's argument is that the human in room number 1 doesn't understand Chinese, doesn't know what the messages are about, doesn't have any intentions to respond to those messages appropriately. And the computer is doing exactly the same as what the human being is doing. And therefore, the computer does not understand Chinese, does not understand the messages, and does not have any intentions to generate appropriate responses to those messages as would be evaluated by a Chinese-speaking person.
So an interesting question is, why do you think that English speakers understand English? So what is the process that those English speakers are going through in their heads, or what is the genetic process? How did they learn English in such a way that convinces you that they know what English is? And how does that differ from what ChatGPT does?
Okay, so we need to go back about 8 million years. We could, of course, go back further, but people who know more about these things than I do, that the first traces or the first evidence that there is something like a language using human being dates back to about 8 million years ago. It doesn't really matter how many million years we take. Now, why did we find the first traces of language? Well, human beings are weaker than many of the animals that prey on human beings in this particular period. And so they have to find some way in which they can defend themselves against their predators. And the way they have larger brains relative to their weight and height compared to the predators. And they discover that they can hunt the predators. In other words, they can become the predators more successfully if they can communicate with each other. Initially, this would be with shrieks and gestures. which is probably still the universal language. And we all communicate with shrieks and gestures in some circumstances, typically when danger is involved. And gradually, the shrieks and gestures became more and more refined until we get languages which look very much like the languages that we have. And now, because we are descended from a whole series of organisms gradually speaking more sophisticated languages, we have genetically the ability to learn language. We don't have the genetic predisposition to learn to speak English, but we do have the genetic predisposition to learn to speak some language or languages. So the first part of the story is that our brains are genetically predisposed in certain very complicated ways, which no one understands, to learn language and to use language appropriately.
So, as you say, language is a uniquely human thing. At least we've assumed it's uniquely human. It seems that something like ChatGPT is really good at replicating language. So, I did an interesting experiment today. My father is an antique dealer, and he has in his possession a papal bull. So it is written by hand in papal Latin, and it's about 350 years old. And over the years, he has tried to get someone to translate it. And there's been a couple of difficulties. The one is it's handwritten, so it's hard to work out what the script says. The second is that there are people around who speak Latin because in South Africa, if you study law, you had to do Latin at a certain era. But that's very different from papal Latin. So the document has remained untranslated and has always remained a mystery to me. So today what I did was I gave ChatGPT a picture of a paper bull with no context at all. And I just said, what is this? It said, it's a paper bull. It's 800 years old. It's written in medieval Latin. It then wrote out in Latin what was said and then translated it into English and seems to have done a stunningly good job. So this particular paper bull that I'd sent is one that is regarded as the second oldest document in the UK. So it was, it's found in Scotland and it's just slightly younger than the Magna Carta. And the article mentions in some small detail what the paper bull is actually about. And ChatGPT seems to have got that and more so. So it's done a whole range of things that would require a number of quite sophisticated human experts. So someone that, first of all, can decipher the script, someone that understands the language, someone that can summarize it. So there's certain kinds of ways of speaking from 800 years ago that are arcane to us, even if we knew what it said to kind of convey that. So there's all these levels of meaning that the machine can do almost instantaneously. And it's part of a quest that my father has been engaged in for at least 20 years and has thus been unsuccessful from when intelligent human beings.
So did you get the machine to translate your father's document?
Not yet. That's next in line.
You should be very careful. So one of the things I do in my spare time is the following. So I am pretty well known on the web as Barry Smith, the ontologist. So ChatGPT knows who I am. If I say, this is Barry Smith, the ontologist, I have the following question. Every couple of days, I ask the question, who is Barry Smith, the ontologist's wife? And so far, I got 65 different responses. All of they were all females. They were all females working or living in Buffalo. Most of them were working in the university. None of them existed. Recently, I've been getting frequently the response, there is no known information about Barry Smith's wife available to me. That's the first response. And then the other response, which I'm getting, is Barry Smith is not married. Now, that's false. And and I tried other experiments, similar experiments just today. So we are working on a second edition of our AI book, and that is to say, Jorps Landkleber and myself. And so we're going through the process of addressing issues about use of language, which we had not addressed before. And one such issue is the issue of, to put it this way, how do we learn language? Do we learn language as a set of facts? Or do we learn language as a set of skills? So is it a case of knowing that or knowing how? And if you look at the literature, and there's a huge body of literature now about large language models, no single piece of literature addresses the relationship between the use of language by large language models and the knowing how versus knowing that issue. So I asked ChatGPT, or I think it was GPT-4 this morning, can you tell me whether the outputs of a large language model such as yourself are based on knowing how or knowing that? And can you describe some articles in the literature which address this matter? So it sent back a discussion of 5 articles, each of which had a rather bland statement of the knowing how versus knowing that, and then another bland statement about how this would relate to large language model. And then it gave the references, DOI numbers and publishers and names of authors and so forth. Every single one of the articles didn't exist. It made them up. And anyway, I could go on and on like this because it's very often the case that it lists articles which do not exist. So I figure that it's very likely that in order to impress you or in order to keep you relaxed, the Pagel-Bull translation may very well contain made-up bits. It likes to please the user. It doesn't like to say, I don't know, and we know the reasons for that. It was trained through reinforcement learning, and the rewards assigned to I don't know were very low, and the rewards assigned to platitudes and friendly gestures and superlatives about any particular person that they asked about, that I get the most rewards. And so they're the ones that the GPT system has been generally producing, even if that meant telling lies.
It may be that you're just using it wrongly. So ChatGPT was not designed to give facts as answers to questions. So that's not what its intended purpose was, and it's not what it's good at. One explanation for what's going on is that it's inventing facts to make you happy, but I don't think that's the correct understanding of what's happening. The correct understanding is that ChatGPT predicts words based on the words that have come before it, based on the huge information library that it has about the ordering of words that have happened in the past. So what it's doing is it's generating references that look like the kind of references it would predict would exist. So my point is, if you're asking it factual questions, it's just going to hallucinate answers a lot of the time, at least the model you're looking at. There are AI models that are designed not to hallucinate. And if you were to go into the back end of ChatGPT, you can change the hallucination setting. So at the moment, it's roughly at 50 out of 100. You could move that right down to 0, and then it will resort to none at all, none of this, no hallucination. It will not hallucinate in any way. It will just say, I don't have an answer to that question. But that's not what we use ChatGPT for, at least not what you should. What you should use ChatGPT for is to generate language that is similar to the language that has just preceded it. So it's very good at writing poetry in a certain style, or it's very good at writing marketing material in a certain style. Now, the question is, why is that not as good, if not better than understanding? So if it can do that, if it can perfectly map language onto language, why think that saying that human beings understand what's going on is offering anything over and above what ChatGPT is doing? So when you say humans understand the content of the poetry they create and ChatGPT doesn't, why is that valuable? What is this nebulous thing called understanding, and why does it add anything at all over and above what ChatGPT is doing when it does something that's designed to do well?
Okay, so first of all, I tried the test case with the articles about knowing how versus knowing that also on Gemini. And I guess Gemini is marketed not just as a source of factual answers, but also as a source of articles because it can actually look up in the web and find the articles. The Gemini failed also. 3 out of 5 of the articles that it suggested were non-existent. So, and secondly, as of course you know, a lot of people don't view ChatGPT or GPT-4 in the way that you would want them to look at GPT-4 because they like to get answers quickly, and they don't know about the dangers of hallucinations to quite the same degree that we do. Now, let me try and give you an account of how I think it is that human understanding is so important. So the AI community has been trying for 50 years to create a chatbot that could replace human telephone answering systems or human-based telephone answering systems in banks and insurance companies and so forth, in such a way that humans would be able to call their bank, get a chatbot on the other end and still be happy. Because at the moment, if you get a computerized response to any kind of phone call, you are generally speaking very unhappy. And I always put the phone down immediately, or I dial 0. The original proposed title for our book was Press 0 for a Human Being, in order to draw attention to this failure. And the failure was the reason why my co-author came to me. He was already a friend from another area of research. He came to me out of the blue and he said, "Barry, I want to write a book with you about AI." Because he's an AI entrepreneur. And his customers kept wanting him to build for them a chatbot. And he would just tell them, you can't build a chatbot. AI doesn't work for chatbots. And after 50 years, we still don't have chatbots that work in the sense of providing relaxing and correct information of the sort that a human being would provide. Now, what is the big difference between between large language models, and I'll just say ChatGPT to keep it simple, and humans when they use language? How is it that the person responding to your bank telephone call can do such a good job where computers do such a bad job? The answer is that humans want things. Now, computers are algorithms. Algorithms can't want things because they can't have any kinds of emotional feelings, or they can't have any kind of understanding. They are algorithms. They are pieces of mathematics which have been programmed into machines to do the kind of work that you described earlier. And they do it very well. We both agree on that. They can't want anything. You can't tell the computer to be nice. You can try and use the reward system in the reinforcement learning to make it be nice, but it's not wanting things. And so the way it's being nice is very, very tightly constrained by the way in which the rewards were assigned when the training program went through. That's a very, very, very narrow set of rewards, which means the kinds of wantings, the desires that the machine has or is trained to seem to have are very narrow and rather fragile. So we can want things, we can desire things. And whenever we want, the three of us want a lot of things as we speak now. So you want to win the argument. You want to have a nice podcast. I want to win the argument. I want to have a nice podcast. But what I want and what you want are actually at odds with each other. And as time goes on, we may want to tell jokes because we think it's getting boring, or so that every conversation involves a toing and froing of wants between the different people involved. And you can, the wants become more complicated, of course, if there are 3 people involved, particularly if 2 of the people in the conversation are lovers and they want certain things and they want the third person to go away. So I could talk for hours about how this want system works. We can have wants only if we understand both what we hear and what we say. And as I say, I can go on and on. It's an amazing complexity of things which happen when, for instance, new people enter into a conversation. It's a new context and new interruptions, somebody is fed up and they want to leave, how do they send a signal and still be polite? A policeman knocks on the door, all kinds of things can happen to a conversation. And we always want things. And that's what keeps the conversation alive. And I can tell that you're not a computer because you're wanting things all the time.
Okay, so granted, humans want things and ChatGPT doesn't, but why does that equate to humans understand and ChatGPT doesn't?
I need to go back now about, I don't know, a million years maybe. So at some point, or for a long time in our history, we basically lived in villages in small tribes, and we didn't have much to do with any other people. So we were restricted to people we trust, people we learned language from, our mothers and so on. And then at some point, we started to venture out, and language came with us. And so people from neighboring villages would speak similar languages because the villages were created with a spin-off from the original village. So you go out into the forest and you encounter somebody that you don't recognize. And this somebody expresses very warm feelings. It's nice to meet somebody from Village X. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And how do you deal with the problem of the rain coming down all the time? And so on. But actually, this stranger wants to steal all your belongings. And he's just using language in order to trick you. So this is a very crucial phase in the history of language. Language is very beneficial for collaboration, but it's also a very, very efficient tool for generating false beliefs in ways which can be dangerous for the target. And the people who fell for these strangers didn't have so many babies as the people who managed to work out that they were being tricked or conned through language. And so we are the descendants of people who worked out how to recognize tricks and schemes and so forth in other people who engaged in linguistic communication. That is a long way of saying we are descended from people who worked out how to understand what people were saying in a very, very rich, crunchy sense, which involves also knowing what they want when they speak.
So one of the things that we intend on doing is after we air this episode with you, we intend on airing an episode where we have a conversation with ChatGPT. Now, some of the people that tune into the show tune in on YouTube, and so they will see us interviewing a cell phone in the ChatGPT episode. But those that listen on Spotify will hear a voice. They will hear a voice called Cove, which speaks in a very natural way. It has an American accent. It pauses, it considers, it asks questions back. It acts in a very human way. And it may be that if we don't introduce that episode as one where we're about to introduce ChatGPT, that our listeners would think that we were interviewing a famous philosopher. Now, of course, I might be setting myself up here for abject failure, and it might be that the episode is disastrous. But if it is indistinguishable, if we have conversations about these sorts of topics, one with a human being and one with the AI, now the AI, I think if we asked it, are you conscious? It's going to say, I'm not. Do you understand this conversation? It's going to say no. But does it look like a conversation conducted by someone that's incredibly knowledgeable? I think it very well might. And so the question is, if they're indistinguishable by an outsider, it might be that it doesn't have the kind of intelligence that human beings have. It has some other kind of intelligence. It operates, as you say, like Searle's Chinese room. It produces the translations. It tells you what you want to know. It would be the same as if you had a Chinese guy in the room, but instead you just have someone, moving around the dials and producing the right answers. What are we missing if you're on the sort of just the user interface bit?
Well, you're cheating a little bit because you haven't actually done it. And so it could very well be that you produce nonsense or you produce something very boring, which is what I would predict. So a few minutes ago, I said, a few seconds ago, actually, I said, people meeting in the jungle and being conned. That's the big difference between what you get from a human being and what you get from a large language model. So large language models do very well where they have representative data, where they have a lot of data in the training set about the topic in question. If you were clever enough to have a conversation with ChatGPT about some philosophical topic, which is already extremely well covered in the training material that we used to train ChatGPT, then it might be that you would have an interesting conversation. But I doubt it, because you will want it to be more interesting. You'd want it to have something new. And something new is by definition not going to have a representative amount of training material to create statistically available pathways to generate a response. So to the degree that you are a good philosopher in this conversation, you will have a bad conversation. That's my prediction.
So I think you're making two errors in your argument. So the one is every time we raise an instance where ChatGPT is very good at something, you counter by giving us an instance where it's bad at something. But of course, those are the easy cases to show that ChatGPT is not doing a good job in those situations and ChatGPT is not behaving the way a person would. And we grant that there are situations where ChatGPT will do a bad job. That's not under debate. The question we're asking you is, in the situations where ChatGPT does a good job, why think that there's anything missing in those situations? And you haven't engaged with that at all. So that's the one error in your reasoning, which I just want you to deal with first, and then I'm going to raise the second.
Okay, so I've dealt with it when I've repeated several times that ChatGPT is just an algorithm. It's just a piece of mathematics. It's a very long function, very, very long. And you apply this function to the next token in a prompt, and then it generates the token, the next most likely token after that. There is no understanding. I don't need to argue for that. It follows from the nature of computing that it's a Turing machine.
Yeah, there's two issues with that. So the one is you might think that that's exactly the way human beings function. So you might think that brains have a genetic structure which is analogous to computer hardware. It's analogous to the set of instructions that would inform ChatGPT. There are a lot of philosophers who think about human minds in exactly this way. They're called functionalists. And functionalists think that human minds function in exactly this way. There's algorithms that inform the way we think. And it's just not clear why ChatGPT is doing something different from the way humans are doing things.
So we spend a lot of time in the book criticizing the computational theory of the mind. And in fact, the main chapter in the book is the longest chapter and the hardest chapter is devoted to illustrating in what ways the mind is different from any machine. So the idea has to do with the distinction between two kinds of systems. On the one hand, there are what we call simple systems, which are characterized by the fact that we understand how they work mathematically. That's the way they were built or the way they work. And so we can predict their behavior under any condition of normal use. So this applies to a thermostat, an iPhone, a laptop, and it also applies to the solar system viewed from a purely gravitational point of view. They're all simple systems. Now, ChatGPT is a simple system because we know exactly how it's going to work. We can predict what it's going to do. It would take a lot of mathematics to do that, but we could in principle predict how it's going to work. And the proof of that is that it works. And it's an artifact. It was built in a certain way in order to work. It executes on a computer. And we know that anything which executes on a computer employs a rather simple mathematics, that the Turing computability and so forth. Now, brains and people and societies and bacteria and thunderstorms and worms and rotting fruit and so on are not simple systems. There's no way in which we can predict mathematically the behavior of what we call complex systems. And that means that the computer is always going to fall short in predicting the behavior of a complex system like the human brain. So pretty obvious, actually. There's no way in which any machine, or indeed any human being, can predict the behavior of another human being, because human beings are complex systems, and you cannot predict the behavior of complex systems using any kind of reliable algorithm. And that's why we have creativity. It's why we have excitement, surprise. It's why we can deal with even the strangest caller when we're working in a bank as a phone operator. It's why traffic police can deal with even the strangest speeding motorist. Because we're human beings, we're complex systems. We can deal with other complex systems by various strategies, which we learned in the dark woods of long ago.
How do you deal with cases where AI appears to act in creative ways? So there are lots of writers who currently write together with ChatGPT, not in the sense that they get ChatGPT to write according to a plot that they've generated, but they get ChatGPT to come up with unique plots that have not been encountered in the literature. According to your view, if what ChatGPT is doing is just reproducing something that's statistically common, that should be impossible. How is it doing that then, on your position?
What is the human being doing in that situation? The human being who is working with ChatGPT, what is he providing? Or she?
Yeah. So I'm a science fiction writer. One day I sat down with ChatGPT and I said, well, I'm encountering a bit of writer's block with my latest novel. I'm not going to tell you what the novel is about, but this is something I'm experiencing, is writer's block. What are the common ways that writers overcome this issue? And then it gave me a list, as you say, a bland response of solutions. And it said, would you like some writing prompts? Just to get you started, just to kickstart you. And I said, sure, give me some writing prompts. And the writing prompts that came out were astonishingly good. And I said to it, these are excellent. They combine themes that are very common in the literature, in the genre that I write in science fiction, but not in ways that I've ever seen. And I'm very familiar with science fiction, both in the literature and films, because that's sort of my obsession. And I'd never seen in any book or film the way that it had combined these features together. That was really compelling. And I was quite shocked. And I said, are these unique? Are these original? It said, yes. Then I did a separate search. I used other AI to search across the internet for instances where these themes had come up, and they'd never been created in a novel or in film in that way. How does that happen according to you?
So I don't have a good definition of creativity. The book was published on the same day that ChatGPT was released, and so we missed a very important feature of AI. And the book is selling quite well, so the publishers said, "Well, we want to do a second edition. This will give you the opportunity to address ChatGPT, and we would like to have something to say about creativity." The first thing that we would say, and this is the kind of algorithm on our part, is that a machine cannot be creative, because creativity is something which requires the features of a complex system. Anything which is mathematically predictable cannot be creative. And so if I then work the argument back from there, I would have to say that what's happening with these plots is that each of them has ingredients which are in the training material. And the ChatGPT has been instructed, in effect, to scramble the training material in those relevant places to produce something which looks to you as if it's completely new. It may look to everybody else as if it's completely new. And it may be that you have a lucky streak and it writes a whole short story which is successful and regarded as a great creative achievement. I doubt it. We're going to see more of that as time goes on. So the rate at which large language models are scaling achieving improvements through scaling seems to be reaching a plateau. And so it's going to be very hard to get anything, I think anyway, much better than what we have now. But we don't know what we will get. What we do know is that the people who are working in the field of what is called artificial general intelligence have lost much of the optimism that they had at the very beginning of the ChatGPT era. So they're now all saying that the large language model pathway is not the pathway to AGI, and they're looking for alternative pathways. The large language models will survive, and they'll continue to be important for the reasons which you understand and you've described, but they won't replace authors. They won't replace composers. This is an interesting question, but I don't think they will replace opera singers or symphony orchestras. We're going to need the kind of creativity that human beings bring. And I can give you actually one concrete example of the kind of contribution that human beings can make. So there are limits to what we can predict mathematically, that's clear. But one particularly problematic area is the area of thermodynamics. And there's a lot of thermodynamics in the brain. You see thermodynamics in smoke clouds, in storms. If you wiggle your finger in a lake, you'll see thermodynamic phenomena. If you drop stones in the lake, how the waves develop is all not predictable. So the thermodynamics is unpredictable. The mathematics is incapable of predicting thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is an important phenomenon for the workings of the human brain. Therefore, there are important features of the workings of the human brain which can never be predicted. There's no way in which ChatGPT or any other kind of mathematical function can simulate the kinds of achievements which are brought about because of the thermodynamic properties of the human brain. So that means that there is always going to be a shortfall. And the shortfall is going to remain even if we move into other kinds of AI. So people are talking about combining large language models with good old-fashioned logic-based or symbolic-based AI. Even that is going to be constrained by Turing computability, and therefore even that is not going to be capable of capturing those features of human mental activity which rest upon things like thermodynamic properties of the brain. Now, if that is the case, then there will always be an area where the human beings are achieving things which cannot be simulated or mimicked by machines. And I think a good example of this is the following. So people play the trumpet. And the trumpet, you can get if you're a really good trumpeter, you can get very, very sensual sounds out of a trumpet. That's a very, very specific thermodynamic property, not of using trumpets straight out, the normal trumpets, but when the trumpeter has a lot of know-how, they can use the trumpet to create these thermodynamic peculiarities, which are labeled. We know what they are. We know what they sound like. We don't know how they're produced, but we know that some people can produce them. These are thermodynamic sounds which contribute to the beauty of certain kinds of performances. Those kinds of sounds, sounds very trivial, but those kinds of sounds, even if they only contribute a very tiny bit to the experience of listening to a certain great symphony performed by a great symphony orchestra, can never be mimicked by a computer.
So on the show, we trade in thought experiments, and I thought it might be quite fun to do a real experiment. And, given that we haven't had the object of our discussion present, I thought I'd invite this to join us. So I'm going to ask it to do something for fun. And this is done live. Can you please produce a unique poem in the style of Beowulf about Spider-Man?
Certainly.
Here's a poem inspired by the epic style of Beowulf, but centered around Spider-Man. In the city of towering steel and stone, where shadows shall long as the night, a hero arose, spun from fate's web, born of the bite with venom's might. Peter, son of Parker, in youth unknown, gained the power of the eight.
But tell me what point you're making here.
Well, I think if I had to ask a human being, come up with a poem in that style about Spider-Man, they could do it. And it would take them, a fair amount of time. And there'd be interesting illusions, and there'd be, the kind of play on words and a stylistic thing. And we would say, wow, that's an impressive thing to be able to do. The fact that my cell phone can do this almost instantaneously is kind of an incredible thing. Now, when we think about creativity, often what I think of as creativity is not creating something entirely new, but taking a series of things that are known and merging them together in a way that's new. So I don't know if anyone has ever written a poem about Peter Parker in the style of Beowulf. It probably doesn't exist, but we've got two things that are known, and we now merge them in this new thing, and now that gives us something enjoyable and impressive.
You are responsible for that creative dimension, not the machine.
So I think there's a unique interaction in the same way that if I had to commission a poet to do it, the poet wouldn't have done it on his own. It's through my input, through my request that this thing comes out. We think about how many artists used to operate. It was through some kind of incentive, some kind of patron. There's a human element. So there's a couple of questions. The one is, could the machines run the world on their own? Maybe not. Can they produce incredible objects with our involvement? Clearly they can. And so it seems that they have some kind of use. And I know in your book, you think that AI is still a thing that's kind of amazing and that it can do various impressive tasks. So what do you think those things are?
Good. So actually, you've given the story yourself just now, but I want to say a little bit more about Beowulf, first of all. So I have tried this trick of getting the ChatGPT to create poems in the style of The Sopranos. And what I notice is that very often the ChatGPT picks a few mannerisms that appear regularly when the Sopranos actors speak, but they don't actually get the style of speech of the Sopranos in any degree. And I think a Beowulf expert would probably find grounds for criticizing what you just presented. Now, the final chapter in our book, it describes the wonderful things that AI has produced already and how it's going to be producing more wonderful things. Wherever we have regular patterns where we can collect a large amount of data, we can use ChatGPT to predict how those regular patterns will be synthesized or will appear again in the future. And we can use that for all kinds of really interesting and valuable purposes, commercial purposes and research purposes. And our favorite example of the way in which artificial intelligence can create something new and vitally important is AlphaFold, which is the protein structure prediction engine produced by DeepMind. And if you look at how AlphaFold works, so there are about 6 blocks. So these are diagrams showing the various steps that AlphaFold performs. And there are 6 blocks, each of which contains multiple sub-blocks. And each block involves a new kind of algorithm being used. So one algorithm they used is the triangle equation of distance in mathematics, which has been known by mathematicians for hundreds of years. And then they use results of protein crystallography because they have to have a basis for how protein structure works. And there are lots of proteins which have been deciphered by very, very careful handwork of crystallography specialists working on benches with traditional human tech. And they put all of this together in a fantastic way. And the result is really valuable information about proteins, which will move pharmaceutical research forward is already moving pharmaceutical research forward in interesting ways. But now every single one of these blocks was created by people. And it took, 47 people to put those blocks together to create this flow, which takes you from the linear amino acid diagram to the structured protein diagram in a form that can be used. And so that's a combination between human beings and computers. You couldn't do it without each of those being involved. And it may be that your Beowulf poem is equally valuable, but we'll have to see. It may be that your science fiction novel that you will write with the help of ChatGPT will be equally valuable, but we have to see.
This could be a contingent problem, though. So it just could take a bit more time. I also think you might be mistaking types and tokens. So it could be that you're saying, well, when I asked ChatGPT to create a Beowulf poem, it might look good on the surface, but there's some issues with it. And so it's not creative. That's your conclusion.
Well, I didn't actually draw that conclusion because I don't have a theory of creativity. I'm working on it, but I don't have one yet. We don't know whether computers can have it. But let me give you the one basic ingredient of the theory of creativity that I am working on. And we talked already about knowing how versus knowing that. I think all creativity involves know-how. It involves very high levels of know-how by people who typically have spent years working in the discipline. And it's a little bit like we can think of the trumpeter in the orchestra again, or the tennis player, or anybody who has real impressive expertise in a difficult activity. They have know-how which they built up by practice, often with a master who's teaching them, coaching them. The Olympic Games is full of creativity. Simone Biles has, 4 tasks, they call it, named after her. That anytime they perform, her name will be used. That's creativity. And it involves know-how. Can ChatGPT have know-how?
Yeah, so this is exactly what I wanted to get at, is if you ask ChatGPT to write a Beowulf poem, you might think the initial attempt is bad. Or let's say you wanted to write dialogue in the style of The Sopranos. You might think, well, it's getting a few of the stylistic elements right, but not the whole shtick. It doesn't have the whole thing. A Sopranos expert will pick up the differences. But the very big mistake you're making is to think that humans could do that too on the first attempt. You would need, as you said, a coach, an expert to sit with them and correct them and tell them what they're doing wrong, just as ChatGPT would. So this is why I say there's a type token mistake. You're assuming that the first token, the first instance that ChatGPT generates is as good as it gets. That's the type. That's what it can produce. That's the kind of thing it can produce. But that's not true. If you iterate with ChatGPT and you train it, you can give it the ability indefinitely into the future of producing exactly the kind of thing that you want, just like you would with a prodigy artist, just like you would with a songwriter or a playwright or an author. If you give it feedback, if you give that person feedback, it will alter what they produce in future, and ultimately they'll become a very good author.
I was actually drawing on the remark of your colleague when he talked about how impressed he was that the computer could produce within seconds this apparently convincing piece of Beowulf poetry. So he was impressed already by the first shot. I would be tempted to be not impressed by the first shot until I'd spoken with an expert on Middle English literature. Now, that I think that you are repeating some of what I said about AlphaFold. So AlphaFold is AlphaFold because of tremendous amounts of human input, which looks very much like an expert training a novice. So there is certainly I think AlphaFold is a piece of creative human achievement, which is made possible by machines. Now, whether we say that proves that machines are creative, that I still hesitate to allow that to be possible because the human input is so crucial.
But here's the question. The human input is crucial in the human case too, when the human is the creator. So the question is, once you've trained the model, right? So once you've got AlphaFold, so you've got the perfect Beowulf author, poet, once you've trained it properly, why is that result? Why is that result? It could produce the identical result. Why, given that it's the identical result to a human creator, and maybe even better than the human creator, why is it missing something?
So we've got what you described already in AlphaFold. AlphaFold does the job now without any human support. The human just enters in the data, and that can be done automatically. So, but no one says that AlphaFold is creative. The AlphaFold is finding a structure in the protein world, which is already there. It's identifying it for us with great impressiveness. So it's fantastic. But the reason it's fantastic is because of all that human input. Now let's take let's suppose that we have it's probably better to science fiction author. Supposing we have a science fiction author, a human being who is trained by experts in science fiction over many years, and he works really hard, and he has the spark, the thermodynamics that you need to be creative, and he really dedicates himself to years and creates fantastic science fiction novels everyone accepts are creative. What would be the counterpart of that story on the machine side?
Well, it seems to me like what could be the case is that the machine model that writes science fiction is different in that it has learned in a different way. And perhaps the mechanisms involved in generating that piece of science fiction are quite different from the human brain. But different doesn't mean worse. Different doesn't mean worse.
Yeah, I try to avoid value judgments by just using the word creativity.
Yes, but value judgments are important here because you might say, okay, so the human brain is thermodynamic in nature, and human creative outputs are thermodynamic in nature. Great. But there's some other term that's going to apply to the way AI generates outputs. And can imagine our AI overlord in 100 years' time saying, human brains just lack this particular quality, and we're going to call it AI dynamic. They just lack this AI dynamic quality. And there's just no human brain that could have this AI dynamic quality. Why? Because AI dynamic quality requires quantum computing that accesses enormous amounts of data, and no human brain can do that. And so, when we look at human accomplishments, they really appear quite weak. They're quite irrational a lot of the time. They don't really do the thing that we ask them to do a lot of the time. It's very different. And so, well, we just don't think they're that valuable. They're just, they're not that valuable. They make mistakes, or humans make mistakes all the time. It just seems you could run the argument exactly the same way in parallel. What I'm trying to get at is it seems to me like you're pointing out difference without substance. So you're saying there is a difference in the way humans operate and the way AI operates. But at no point have you given us a reason to think that the human injection, whatever humans are injecting into the mix, is anything more valuable or interesting or useful than what AI is injecting itself into the mix, into its mix. But it's not clear to me why. I mean, you've used this pattern of argument throughout our questions, throughout your answers to our questions. So what you're doing is every time we point out, we ask a question about why AI is worse or less than in some way or lacking something. And you keep looking at the genesis of the output. So you say, well, if you look at human beings, we need to understand, go back 100 million years or 8 million years or 1 million years ago, and look at how these processes developed, right? Now, that's a particular way of understanding the world, which a lot of philosophers reject. They call it the genetic fallacy. So when you look at the genesis of something and you say, well, the genesis of something accurately describes and explains what it is, that's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a mistake in thinking. It's the genetic fallacy. You can't describe something fully and fully understand it by telling us where it came from.
I was I wasn't using the history in order to describe what something is. I was using it to describe why it's there.
But we're not interested in why it's there. We're interested in what it is. And you haven't answered that question.
So you're interested to describe what human use of language is. That's rather a big challenge, but you're interested in why it's different from what some computer of the future that you describe. And you use quantum computers in passing. Quantum computers will never be able to compute anything that is not computable already by existing computers. They'll just do it, if they ever exist, that's another question. They'll do it enormously more quickly, but they won't be able to compute anything new.
So the question Mark and I have asked you over and over again is, what is missing from computer output? And what you keep saying is what's missing is this long story about how humans want, computers don't. Humans have a will, computers don't. Humans have creativity, computers don't. But it seems that they can both produce the same output, given that there's different genesis.
Actually, I gave you what I think is still a very convincing argument about precisely this point, which is the argument relating to the non-existence of useful chatbots. There's been 50 years of research by AI. Every AI engineer wants to create a useful chatbot. And you have the Beowulf poem is not an example of a useful chatbot. The useful chatbot is a machine that can address your needs in ways which satisfy you as a human being, when your needs might be quite complicated. And most importantly, they might be something that the chatbot or the trained underlying system has never encountered before. How can humans do that? Because they have desires and will, and they have they learn that you have to be friendly to the customer in certain ways, and you tweak out what the customer's needs are, even if the customer expresses those needs in ways that you've never seen before. Humans can do that. ChatGPT can't do that because the input is not in its training material.
Suppose we accept that, which I'm not sure we should accept. There's quite a lot of companies today that use AI for its chatbots. Amazon does, Facebook, Meta does. But let's just assume that you're right, that chatbots could never do as good a job as people. That doesn't explain why AI is weaker than humanity in areas where it does succeed. So just by pointing out an area where it doesn't succeed, that doesn't explain why it's worse in areas where it does. So again, this reliance on countering with an example where AI fails doesn't answer questions about where it succeeds. I don't think Mark or anyone would argue that ChatGPT is a person. We're not arguing that. And so by arguing that ChatGPT can't do certain things that persons can do, yes, we agree. ChatGPT can't do certain things that persons can do. But that doesn't mean that it can't do anything that a person can do.
So again, my best example, for me, the most impressive piece of computer AI is AlphaFold. AlphaGo is very impressive too. They are ways in which computers can do things which humans do, but they can do it much more impressively than humans do. So there are lots of cases where AI systems perform doing things which humans do, but doing them better. The issue is they're always achievements along a certain narrow thread. So folding of proteins, winning games of Go, that fantastic, wonderfully intelligent, even some people say even creative, because they invented new strategies that masters of Go were very impressed by. Maybe that's creativity. That's fine. So the thesis of the book pertains to AGI, not to AI in general, but both Jobst and myself, we're big fans of AI, but we think AGI is impossible. So it's not clear what is missing, since we both believe that there are ways in which computers perform better than human beings, just along these narrow tracks. And you can't put these narrow tracks together. That's what they're trying to do, but there's always something missing. And And that's the reason why they themselves have lost faith in the possibility of AGI along the LLM track, which they were initially so enthusiastic about.
Well, Barry, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Jason has done his utmost to root for the machines.
I thought he was a machine. No, really, just
I think there's quite a good likelihood. There's a point in time where you start to say this guy's a little bit too invested in a certain outcome here to be a human being. So all I can do is promise that we'll try and give ChatGPT as much of a ribbing as we've given you when we get a chance to interview it. And there'll be some external verification as to whether it's been dull, boring, or incorrect. But if you're listening to this episode on YouTube, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think that the humans will ultimately get beaten by the machines? That Jason really is a machine? We can't wait to hear from the comments. And of course, all bots will be banned.